We're going to get started. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome today Professor Catherine Lang for the Rochon Distinguished Lecture Series. Dr. Lang is a professor of physical therapy, occupational therapy, and neurology, and associate director for the Movement Science PhD program at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, Missouri. She received her physical therapy degree from the University of Vermont and her PhD in movement science from Washington University, and then she completed a postdoc fellowship at the University of Rochester. She's a fellow of both the American Society for Neurorehabilitation and the American Physical Therapy Association. Dr. Lang directs the Neurorehabilitation Research Laboratory, which aims to develop effective and efficient individualized rehabilitation for people with stroke and other neurological injuries. Their studies are focused on characterizing neurobehavioral changes over the course of stroke recovery, developing new and optimizing current motor interventions, and improving clinical practice. She has had continuous funding from the NIH since 2005, which is quite the accomplishment. So thank you. Welcome, Dr. Lang. I'll just make a final note that this is a lecture for credit as well for the CPIN program. For those of you who are CPIN students, please make sure to fill out the lecture report at the end of the lecture. So welcome, Dr. Lang, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I was invited for 2020 and then we canceled. I was hoping that by May 2021, I would get to come to Toronto because it's such a beautiful place. But unfortunately, I'm in St. Louis today and it's raining outside. So I don't get to share in your lovely city. So just in terms of disclosures, I have nothing that I'm selling you today. I do receive money from various sources and I provide opinions and advice to other places. Everything that I'm going to tell you about today, I get to talk about, but it's really the work of many other people. And who I am is strongly influenced by who trained me and who I've trained with and get to work with. And so this tree is me, and there's 4 individuals there that were substantial parts of my pre-doc, postdoc, and early career training. The people that are coming in here now are the various trainees that I've had, and you'll notice that there's an empty branch hanging out right here in case anyone gets really excited. They want to come and talk to us about the work that we do. These are my fellow faculty members within Washington University Physical Therapy who I have collaborated with and have helped me achieve different scientific milestones. And then, of course, I have collaborators within the Washington University School of Medicine, and then from other forests or groups across the country. So I get to be the one to talk today, but really the work is a product of many, many people. Of course, where I work and where I live informs my perspective on both movement and rehabilitation. And in my department, primary department, which is physical therapy, we are interested in the human movement system, which is a system of systems. The nervous, the muscular, and the skeletal systems are the primary movers. And then the ones in red in that are kind of the support structures to movement. And I have primarily studied stroke, which is, of course, a problem with the cardiovascular system, and then its effect on the nervous system that then causes changes in movement. Of course, as was mentioned, I work in the United States. That little dot there is St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm providing these statistics just so you know kind of the practicalities of what we live in when we think about providing rehab care for people. So the median length of stay in our acute care hospital is about 3 days. A little over 30% get to go to inpatient rehab facilities where the average length of stay is about 16 days. About 10% of people, a little over 10% of people with stroke get to go to a skilled nursing facility where their average length of stay is about 30 days. And then about 25% of our folks go home with home or outpatient services. And even if they get those services, there's not a large number of visits. So we're looking for ways to make a difference in people's lives in a relatively short period of time. My lab studies a bunch of different things. I was talking with Mark Bailey a little bit about remote limb ischemic conditioning earlier. Today, we're going to focus in on this segment right here, where we're interested in thinking about using wearable sensors to measure what people are doing when they're not with us, that is, when they're out in their homes and in the community. And so I'm going to cover four different topics today. The first thing that we're going to address is just to reinforce the point that the purpose of rehabilitation is to improve performance in daily life. And I suspect that that doesn't take a lot of convincing with this audience. Just to orient you, we can think about the World Health Organization ICF model, which the top part of is displayed here. And it's this differentiation between the capacity for activity and the performance of activity that's an overlooked part of the model. So we take that activity part and we can measure what people are capable of doing, how they can execute a task or an action in the clinic, and then whether they we can measure that activity or a set of activities or the overall amount of activity when they're performing in their free living environment. And then, of course, we can split performance into either perceived performance that is usually measured by self-report, typically questionnaires, or direct measures of performance, which we've been doing with wearable sensors, but some of you have been doing with the egocentric camera systems. And so throughout the talk, you're going to see the symbol of the clinic here to indicate measures of capacity and the symbol of the house to indicate measures of performance. So I just, again, want to make the point that people go to, and in the United States have to pay for rehabilitation appointments to improve their performance in daily life. And so oftentimes, particularly in our outpatient setting, insurance providers require what we call a copay. So every time they go to an outpatient visit, they have to pay $25 or $30, which means that every time they come to see us, hopefully we're doing something that's worth $25 or $30 for them. So again, emphasizing that it's the performance that they're interested, not getting necessarily better on a standardized test. And in surveys of patients that we've seen in the lab for various research projects, nearly 90% of patients' self-identified goals are for better performance in daily life. They rarely say, you know, I want to get better on this walking test, or I want to get better on this upper limb test. What they say is, I want to walk better at home, or I want to be able to use my arm to get myself dressed, or bathe or feed myself. So moving on, I want to show you how we can measure performance in daily life with wearable sensors. And we actually need different tools, in fact, these wearable sensors, to assess the capacity for activity versus the performance of activity. And the American Physical Therapy Association, the ANPT, or Academy of Neurologic Physical Therapy, has spent a tremendous amount of work developing core measures that can be used across neurological populations, across sites. And some of these are listed here, the 5 core measures are listed here. And all of these measure someone's capacity for activity. We actually need different tools to measure performance, and we can measure perceived performance, as I mentioned. So something like the stroke impact scale or the motor activity log lets us understand the patient's perception of how they're coping with activities in daily life. And then we can make direct measures of performance, such as measuring the steps per day with a step activity monitor. We can calculate different variables from that activity monitor, or use wearable sensors like we've frequently used on the wrists to get variables such as a use ratio or hours of use. And the data from wearable sensors are easy to collect, but it's actually rather hard to figure out what to do with the data. And so the paradigm that we've been using for the last, I would say, 10 years is to use wearable sensors. The ones on the left in red are the older version, and the ones on the right in black are the newer version. And we put one on each wrist, and they wear them for 24 or more hours as they go about their daily living. And we've spent, I would probably say, the last 7 years working to understand how different variables that we can derive from these data might be meaningful for clinical practice. And what I'm going to share with you today are the successes that we have with that. I'm not going to share with you all the rabbit holes that we've been down that didn't actually work out. But I'm happy when I meet with the trainees later this afternoon to talk about those. This is just to remind you that upper limb activity in daily life is bilateral. These are a bunch of clip art pictures showing you that as you use your hands, typically you're using both hands together. And sometimes your hands are doing the same thing, such as the little boy putting on the shirt. And sometimes they're doing different things, such as holding your phone and scrolling through it with your finger on your other hand. And it turns out that when we measure the activity in daily life with sensors, that upper limb activity in daily life is also bilateral. And so here's a picture of the red earlier sensors. And we collected a sample of 74 community dwelling adults to look at and try and get an understanding of what typical upper limb performance looks like in daily life. And just as a really simplistic measure, you can measure the number of hours that the dominant limb is moving and the number of hours the non-dominant limb is moving. And the dominant limb moves about 9 hours a day, and the non-dominant limb moves about 8.5 hours a day. And those are statistically different from each other by about 30 minutes. But overall, most of the time when one limb is moving, the other limb is moving. And that can be expressed in a ratio shown here in the blue bar, corresponding to the right y-axis, where you can see that we get a use ratio that the non-dominant side divided by the dominant side that's really close to 1, again implying that you're using both hands a similar amount throughout the day. And we can see this when we plot the dominant arm use measured in hours by the use ratio. And what you can see is that whether you're a couch potato, so whether you have around 5 hours a day, or whether you're an overachiever, this gentleman that was about 15 hours a day, you can see that regardless of how much you use the limb, that you're using both limbs a similar amount. That is, that use ratio is very tightly controlled and with an average value of about 0.95, 0.96, and a very narrow standard deviation. And that makes it a really useful variable when we start to think about who might be different from normal or typical, and who might be moving closer towards typical. So a good way to be able to assess progress over time. On a little bit more complex level, we can draw pictures like this blue tree. And this tree represents the contribution, the instantaneous contribution of activity of the upper limbs on the x-axis. So if you are in the middle there at 0, then both limbs have similar accelerations. And then as you move towards the left, the dominant limb accelerates more. As you move towards the right, the accelerations are greater in the non-dominant limb. The height or the y-axis is the intensity of movement. And then the bars on either side would be activity that's isolated in just the dominant or just the non-dominant limb. And then the color bars indicate the frequency. So colors that are warmer or hotter, you spend more time in that space, and colors that are colder, you spend less time. And essentially what we know from this study that included some videotape recording to help us understand what the different colors mean in terms of specific activities, that small activities with small accelerations show up in this kind of heart or heat zone in the middle. And then accelerations where you would have a lot of acceleration with one hand and less acceleration of another would turn out on the ends. And the really interesting part about this study was, we had 74 people and we essentially had 74 trees. And all of these trees are symmetrical. All of the trees have the warm glow in the middle. And it became a really kind of uniform picture that surprised us across neurologically intact individuals. Moving on, I can tell you that even simple variables that we can calculate are an early indicator that out-of-clinic measures are critical. And what we're looking at here is a sample of people with stroke. And the x-axis is the hours of the paretic upper limb activity, and the y-axis is the hours of the non-paretic limb. And what you can see is there's a strong correlation between the hours of paretic and the hours of non-paretic, and it's a positive correlation. So it's not like you might imagine they can't use one hand very well, so they use the other hand a lot. they can't use one hand very well, so they actually don't do anything with the other hand, which was quite surprising to us. And we've seen this same positive correlation in 2 separate studies right now. So we suspect that once you've seen it a couple times, then you start to believe that it's really true. I should tell you, as we're going along, feel free to type questions in the chat. And then when we get to the end of this section, I'll be happy to answer questions about the methodology. We know that our sensor-based performance measures are responsive to change. I'm just going to show you an example of that. The picture on the far right is just that normal or typical tree that we developed from the accelerometer data. And so here's a person that had moderate paresis in one upper limb about 10 days post-stroke. And now the non-paretic side is displayed on the left, and the paretic slide is displayed on the right. And you can see that there's no warning below in this picture. The bar for the non-paretic side is higher than the bar for the paretic side. And there's not very many intensities, and that picture is a little bit skewed towards the non-paretic side. As they go through inpatient rehab, and we test them again wearing the same sensors, you can see that these sensor measures are responsive to the changes that occurred during the rehab, and we develop a much more normal tree. We still don't have the frequency of activity that we're looking for, but now they're able to use the limbs equally throughout the day with equivalent accelerations. So these measures are responsive and can detect changes. I do want to share with you that perceived and direct measures of performance are not interchangeable. And so the way that we did this is we had people fill out a questionnaire, the motor activity log, that rates their contribution of their affected limb to their activities throughout daily life. And then we subtracted the score that we got from that from a variable on the sensors that reflects that same symmetry. And what we see is a distribution that looks like this. So this is a histogram. The number of participants are on the y-axis, and the difference between the questionnaire versus the sensor-based measure is shown on the x-axis. And so people that scored between plus and minus 10%, the vertical lines there we defined as accurate. And if you reported, if you were in this range, you were an over-reporter, and if you were on the left, you were an under-reporter. And what you can see is that you have some people who are accurate, you have some people who are over-reporters, and some people who are under-reporters. And what I'm not showing you here is this was at the beginning of an intervention, and we repeated it at the end, and we still had a similar shape distribution. We had a few more over-reporters, so it was a little bit more symmetrical. But people, very, very, very small portion of the sample was accurate both times. We included people who sometimes were under-reporters and then they became accurate, or sometimes were an over-reporter and then they became an under-reporter, and so on. And so there was no rhyme or reason that we could find within the patient characteristics as to whether we could determine if someone fit into one of those categories. Which leads me to suggest that we're actually measuring slightly different constructs when we ask somebody about their activity versus directly measure it. And if we have an intervention where we want to change their perception of their activity, then we maybe have a primary outcome that's a self-report. But if we have an intervention where our goal is to change the direct measure of that, then we probably need a primary outcome that is a direct measure, sensors or some other way to do that. So I've told you about how we want to improve performance in daily life, and I've told you that we can measure that with wearable sensors. Before I move on to all the strange things that we found over the last couple of years, I'm going to stop and take a few questions.
All right, Dr. Lang, there's a couple of questions in the chat. One is, how do you define hand use to calculate use ratios?
So the use ratio is simply, we set a threshold on the accelerometers that it's a threshold of 2 activity counts, which with the actigraphs is a very small gravitational unit value, like 0.003, 0.03, sorry, 0.03. And then anytime the accelerometer detects a signal that's higher than that, that tells us that the upper limb was moving. And we just simply sum the seconds over the course of the 24-hour wearing period, and then take the ratio of the left-hand seconds to the right-hand seconds. So it's not a direct measure of hand use. Like, I wouldn't say that you're grasping and manipulating objects, but the upper limb is moving and interacting with things.
Thank you. Another one with these data, are arm movements associated with mobility, such as walking, included in the data?
They are. So one of the things that we did early on was we actually had, I'm not showing you this data, but we actually had people wearing 4 sensors. So 2 on the arms, 2 on the wrists, and 2 on the ankles. And we were able to, particularly in the neurologically intact individuals, identify when they were walking and then pull out the periods of walking. And I can't speak for what would happen in Canada, but the people that we were recruiting in the US actually walked very little a day. It was typically about less than an hour, less than an hour and a half for most individuals, and that it really didn't change the picture. And it definitely doesn't change the ratio values where you control for the left and the right. And then we did the same thing in the patient samples that we've seen. We were less able, as you might imagine, to detect episodes of walking. We, instead of being 98% accurate, we were probably in the 90s and 80s. But those didn't change the picture, and those folks were walking, less than 45 minutes a day typically. So it doesn't make a big influence on what we're seeing.
All right, I'm going to keep asking. There's a bunch of questions. I'll leave it up to you how many you want to take now and how many you want to leave to the end. But the next one was, would there be any specific criteria for setting the boundary of accurate performance? I assume it's for the underreporting, overreporting. I mean, I know y plus 1 minus 1 or minus 0.1 was used for the boundary.
Can you ask that one again?
Sorry. Would there be any specific criteria for setting the boundary of accurate performance? I know what plus 1 to minus 0.01 was used for the boundary.
Oh, well, so different metrics have different scales. So the use ratio extends from 0 to actually above 1. You do sometimes get left-handed people who have values slightly above 1, since left-handed people tend to be more ambidextrous than right-handed people. The magnitude ratio values are bounded at 7 and -7. I'm not sure I'm answering. I can keep going with this, with what we're doing, and then we can talk more about the specifics later. How does that sound?
So, sorry, you want to keep going? Or
do you have one more quick one, or?
Maybe one more here. Did you observe over and underreporters in healthy subjects? If yes, what type of people, personality, age, mental state, etc., contribute to over and or underreport?
So we did not do this in healthy subjects because the questionnaire tops out in healthy subjects. So all of the healthy subjects, the questionnaire is the motor activity log, which is framed as before your stroke, comparison to before your stroke. And so there's no way to get that questionnaire score from healthy controls. Within the patients that we studied, we looked for a whole bunch of different patient characteristics, but did not find anything that would distinguish between underreporters, accurate, and overreporters. But that may be a function of sample size. It's the kind of thing where you would need probably in the 500 to 1,000 range in terms of sample size to be able to get small enough distributions of and enough people in each category to really be able to piece that out. Okay, I'm going to keep going. So, one of the interesting things about as you start doing things with technology is that you start ending up with more questions than you're answering. So I'm going to show you some of the things that quite surprised us, and maybe they don't surprise you at all, and that would be interesting to hear also. So the first thing is that when you're thinking about persons post-stroke, capacity may not equal performance. And what I'm going to show you here is just some examples of a data set that we have of 73 people with stroke. And I'm plotting the capacity on the x-axis. So can't is illustrated in the N near the zero origin, and can in green over here. And then the y-axis would be performance, where if somebody doesn't do something, it's down here, and somebody does do something, it's up in the higher end. And so here's just an example of a participant with stroke that can't do much and doesn't do much. And the zero here, the red zero, is the Action Research Arm Test score, which is a measure of upper limb capacity that spans from 0 to 57. And 0 is they aren't able to get any points on any of the items. It doesn't mean they can't move their limb. It just means they can't get any points on any item. And you can see that this person is a good match. They can't do much and they don't do much. The next person is someone that on our test, we would say they can't, but they actually do quite a bit. So this is someone who scored a 22 on the Action Research Arm Test, which is in kind of the lower third of the scoring. They would get a partial score on many of the items, but not be able to complete that much. But if you look at their blue tree here, you can see that they're a little bit asymmetrical, but they tend to have some higher intensity, and they have a nice warm glow in the middle of their picture. And that's in contrast to somebody who you would think can but doesn't. So this is someone who had a 45 on the Action Research Arm Test. But if you look at their accelerometer data, you can see that that blue tree is smaller, shorter, and there's very little activity occurring, as you can tell by the dark blue colors. And then finally, the kind of patient that we would all be looking for, someone that can and does. So this last person had a 51 on the Action Research Arm Test, and a pretty symmetrical plot that is not too far from the typically neurologically intact control subjects. So that's upper limb data. We've also done a little bit of lower limb data. So I'm going to show you, this is a data set of people with stroke and walking. And so now the x-axis is going to be still our capacity measure, but it's going to be walking speed. And our y-axis is going to be steps per day. And this is just all of those individuals plotted on there. And what you can see is that that's kind of a cloud, right? There's not a correlation measure or a relationship that's easily accessible in that data. And I just want to hone in on this area that's about 0.7 meters per second walking speed. So that would be a pretty good walking speed that we might see in outpatient clinics. And we're starting to think of these people as pretty functional. And if this person came into my clinic, any of these people that are in the red oval came into my clinic, I would measure them all as around 0.7 meters per second in terms of walking speed. And from that measurement, I would have no idea that some of them are walking 12,000 steps a day, and others are walking, only about 3,000 steps a day. So just to illustrate the point that what we see in front of us in the clinic is not necessarily what they're doing when they're not with us, and the value of thinking about what they're doing when they're in their home and community. One of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is that we may be able to provide better services if we know more about the relative trajectories of change early after stroke. So we know an awful lot about the trajectories of recovery in terms of impairment level measures. And we know a lot about the trajectories of recovery in terms of capacity measures, but we know almost nothing about the trajectories of performance measures. And so this is the experimental design that we use. They have a stroke, and then we measure them at 2, 4, 6, 8, 12, 16, 20, and 24 weeks post-stroke. And then we're making a measure of impairment, and that is the Fugl-Meyer. It extends from 0 to 66, and so higher is going to be better. We use the Action Research Arm Test that goes from 0 to 57. Higher, again, is better. And then we're using our sensors to measure our performance in daily life, and we're extracting, in this case, 2 duration variables. And I should tell you that the duration variables are, in people with stroke at least, are strongly correlated to the magnitude variables, the variability variables, and so on and so forth. And then each participant has all these measures, and each individual curve is modeled with a longitudinal or hierarchical linear analyses. We happen to use a 3-parameter logistic model, and we're able to look at the rate of change around the inflection point, the value when they hit a plateau, And then importantly, the time at reach, they reach 90% of plateau. And that's what we're defining as kind of where they're relatively fixed in their upper limb performance in daily life, or you can use, some psychologists might use the term their motor behavior in everyday life. And so what we can see from this data, first of all, is that the 3-parameter logistic model fits the data really well at each level of measurement. These are just 2 examples. And what you're seeing here is time post-stroke on the x-axis. The impairment and capacity test scores are on the left y-axis, and then the use ratio is on the right y-axis. And the gray line is the impairment measure, the black line is the capacity measure, and the blue line is the performance measure. And I'm just showing you these so that you can see that the model of the data fits the data very well. And then I'm going to show you here that heterogeneity of this data is the norm, not the exception. And so here are all 62 people and their predicted performance curves as modeled by the 3-parameter model. Here's all of their activity or capacity curves, and then the predicted use ratios and the time post-stroke. And so what you can see is that we've recruited a range of people. We have people that have a lot of impairment and poor capacity, as well as people with a little bit of impairment, or only a little impairment and a lot of capacity, and that's mirrored over in the performance measures, where again, we have a range of values. And then we're able to take a look at the timing of the plateaus. And what I'm going to show you is that the upper limb performance seem to plateau relatively early post-stroke, and that these plateaus do not lag the plateaus in performance and capacity. And so this is the way we get that. We use bootstrapping across the data sample to build a distribution that is assumption-free, so we don't have to follow the assumptions of parametric statistical models. And then we're able to derive estimates of the time of plateau. And then we're able to do that for each person for each level of measurement, and use a kind of pairwise comparisons that control for, that look within individuals and control for how one individual may be different from the group, to get at the timing of plateaus across measurement levels. And so here's that data. And I should say that this data is currently under review right now with a journal. So I don't think it's going to change, but my messaging around it might have to change depending on whether or not the reviewers like the way we've messaged it in the article that we submitted. So here we have time post-stroke on the x-axis, and then the 4 different measurements are on the y-axis. And just starting at the top, you can see that the upper extremity Fugl-Meyer score, our impairment level, seems to plateau a little after 4.5 weeks post-stroke on average. And then the little bars are the 95% confidence interval of that average. The action research arm test, which is the black dot, seems to stabilize just before 6 weeks post-stroke. So it's about a week after it's about actually 9 days on average after the upper limb Fugl-Meyer, which kind of fits our general understanding and previous literature that suggests that impairment recovers, and then people learn to move with the impairments that they have and integrate the emerging motor abilities into their capabilities, I should say, and become a little bit more functional. But the really surprising thing that we see here is that the use ratio actually plateaus about 24 days post-stroke on average. And then the paretic hours matches the action research arm test. So 2 separate measures of performance, one of which seems to plateau very, very early. We had initially hypothesized that these should plateau after the impairment and capacity level measures, because we figured that people would gain ability to move, incorporate that movement into functional activities, and then to translate those functional activities into better performance at home. And what you see is that's not the case. They definitely do not lag. And in fact, the use ratio value suggests that people may be fixed in their motor behaviors at home before neurological and functional recovery has occurred. So really important thing to know and think about as you're providing rehabilitation to people with stroke. Lots of people are always curious about what predicts use ratio or paretic hours in these impairment measures. So I'm just going to show you a couple of factors that we've looked at that actually predict the shape of these trajectories. And as you expect, better capacity is going to lead to quicker and better recovery of performance. So here we're looking at use ratio on the left and paretic hours on the right. And what I've just modeled here for you to show you is someone with a low action research arm test, so 1 standard deviation below the mean, and then someone with a high action research arm test, 1 standard deviation above the mean. And what you can see is that the high group has a higher plateau, as you would expect, and actually achieves that plateau sooner than the people with the low capacity measures. And the same is true when you look at hours of use. So you get better more quickly and you have better recovery of performance when you have higher capacity. Exactly what you would expect clinically. We were also interested in concordance. So when the dominant limb is affected by the stroke, then we call that concordance. And so here we're looking at the same kind of graphs, except for now the lines represent instances where there was concordance by the dashed line and there was not concordance by the solid line. And what's actually interesting here is that the eventual performance or the plateau that was achieved was better for those that had a concordant dominant and paretic limb, but it actually took a little bit longer. And so what that suggests to us is that people might be willing to try to incorporate their paretic limb in daily life a little bit longer than when it's their dominant limb than when it's their non-dominant limb. We've also tested measures of hemispatial neglect, which did not influence the trajectories. Measures of, I should say, a cognitive screener, not a precise measure of cognition, but the MoCA results in lower plateaus for those that have more cognitive deficits, as you might imagine, and a host of other potential modifiers of these trajectories. And I'm happy to talk more about that at the end. One of the things that people always talk about is people's willingness to use their limb. And so one of the things that we did in this cohort is we measured some of people's thoughts and feelings about using the limb. And the take-home point from this slide is, at least for the upper limb, performance early after stroke is not limited by someone's belief, confidence, or motivation. And so what people did is they answered questions about whether or not they believed improvement of the upper limb was possible over here on the left, whether they were confident that they knew how to use their arm and hand, and then whether they were motivated to use their arm and hand more. And if people strongly agreed with that statement, they were colored in dark red. If they slightly agreed, it was a lighter red. Slightly disagree was gray, and strongly disagree was black. And what you can see is at all time points post-stroke, when these people were asked, the vast majority of them felt that they believed that they could improve more, that they were confident, and that they were motivated to use it. And actually the people that started showing up out here in the black were the people that actually had recovered to the equivalent of a neurologically intact individual. So they no longer felt like they needed to use it more, or were believing that more recovery is possible because they were at the top of the scales. The thing that did seem to be intersect with the performance was actually reported barriers to upper limb performance. And so at all these same time points, people were asked about these different barriers. There was 13 of them. So things like, I don't have enough movement to work with, I'm feeling like I can't do things correctly, I'm too tired, I'm not interested. And then we compared the percentage of people that said yes to each of these things at the different weeks. And what I'm showing you here is just week 2 and week 24. And it turns out that Self-reported barriers to recovery change over time, both in their nature and in the number of them. So the average number of barriers at 2 weeks was about 3.5, and that had fallen to just over 2 by 24 weeks. And that the number of barriers was related to performance early on, but not later. And so this suggests that, one of the places to think about in terms of rehab strategy is to see if you can ease some of the barriers. And it may not be a good use of our time to try and increase someone's belief, confidence, or motivation, because those are already high. And as many of you on this webinar know, there's a whole body of literature about health behavior that can shape and inform us about how to do that. So moving on, I want to just illustrate, I've already shown you that capacity may not equal performance, and now I'm going to show you that a change in one may not equal a change in the other. And so I'm just going to first show you a couple of examples. This is an outpatient sample that was collected in Chicago, in case you think that it's only in St. Louis that we have these problems. And here's an example of someone who was participating in outpatient therapy, and they were able to improve both their capacity and their performance. Again, the same blue trees I'm showing you here, and then the red numbers represent the Action Research Arm Test score again. And you can see that from initial assessment to 1 month to the discharge assessment, which was about 3 months after the initial assessment, you can see that the tree becomes more symmetrical and closer to normal, and they have a nice gain on the Action Research Arm Test. Unfortunately, that was only a small portion of the sample. We also saw people that looked like the person in the middle. So this is someone who had a 34 at their initial assessment. At a 2-month assessment, they had a 42, and the discharge assessment at 4 months, they were up to a 48. So if I was the treating clinician, I would have thought I had done a great job, because they had made a substantial change on this Action Research Arm Test or capacity measure. But if you look at the data that's recorded from the accelerometers, you can see that the picture on the bottom here is really no different than the picture on the top. And then the final example that we saw in this cohort was people who didn't change on either. So here we have someone with an Action Research Arm Test of 3 initially and 4 at the end. So, easily within the measurement error. And you can see that they're not doing much at home, and that doesn't change. Those are just examples. Now I'm going to show you some more sensor data. So this is from 134 people that have been participating in outpatient therapy at 5 clinics around the US. And this includes people that have stroke, and they're monitored they're enrolled in upper limb rehab and measured on the same Action Research Arm Test and the same measures that we've been talking about. It also includes people with stroke who are wearing step activity monitors. And so we're measuring their walking capacity with a 10-meter walk test and their steps per day at home. And then it also includes people with Parkinson's disease who are referred to therapy, have mobility goals, and are expected to improve in that mobility. Again, measuring walking speed and steps per day. So I'm going to show you that this is not just an upper limb problem. And this is the percentage of people that show up in each quadrant. And so we have about 1/3 of the sample, which is not that surprising, that fail to get better on the capacity measure and fail to get better on the performance measure. We have 22% of the sample, or less than that, that we would call a success. That is, they got better on the capacity measure and they got better on the performance measure. We end up with about 1/3 who get better on the measures that we do in the clinic, but fail to get better at home. So those are the ones that the clinicians would consider a success, because they got better on the measures in the clinic. But what we wouldn't know if we weren't measuring what they were doing outside of the clinic, that they aren't actually walking more in daily life. And then what was really interesting in this sample is we actually have 10% in this lower right quadrant here. Those are people who failed to get better on the capacity measure in the clinic, but actually improved their performance at home. And so these are people that the clinician would say that they failed to change them, but the clinician has, the patient and clinician have actually done a good job together, helping them to get better in being able to move in their daily life when they're not in the clinic. So again, just reinforcing this point that the measures that we take in the clinic may not reflect what people are doing, and that changes in one don't necessarily carry over to changes in the other. And without these measures of what people are doing, without these direct measures of performance, we may be missing an important part of the picture as we're making clinical decisions, setting goals, and monitoring the outcomes of our therapy. I should tell you, this is unpublished data. The sample is a little bit larger now. So treat these percentages with a grain of salt. They're very, very generous estimates of change, and the actual percent values might change, but the ballpark is pretty reasonable. And here I'm going to show you the same thing. I'm just going to break it out for you to show you that this lack of change of performance is not just an upper limb stroke problem. So here's the numbers of upper limb stroke. And actually, we ended up with 38% who changed in both. When we look at people with stroke who are undergoing mobility, walking rehab for goals with mobility, you can see that that number is a little bit smaller in the box, but we have a little bit bigger number right here. And then in terms of people with Parkinson's disease, we have a really big number of people who get better in the clinic, but a much smaller number of people who get better both in the clinic and at home. So again, treat the percentages cautiously. They're not fixed because right now they're just estimates from the data that we have, but it does give you an inkling, again, that this is not just an upper limb problem, and it's not just a stroke problem. It's probably a neuro rehab problem, and I don't know if we have any musculoskeletal rehab colleagues on the line, but I bet this extends beyond neuro rehab population to rehab of patients with other conditions as well. Now, when we think about measuring performance in daily life, particularly with walking, variability in daily performance makes it really hard to determine if patient makes real changes. And so here what we're plotting is the average steps per day against the standard deviation of steps per day when people wore the step activity monitors for 7 days. And the black dots are people with Parkinson's disease, and the gray dots are people with stroke. And you can see that there's a general relationship such that as you start walking more per day, you get more variable. And for those of you that are wearing sensors on their wrists that are measuring steps per day, and if you're an active person, you know that this is true. You know, yesterday I went for a run with friends and I walked over 16,000 steps. And by the end of today, when I'm in meetings all day, I'm going to be lucky to hit 5,000. So I have a great deal of variability. I can look at variability in terms of the coefficient of variation. So that's simply the the standard deviation divided by the mean. This is a histogram, and what you can see is that most people have coefficients of variation that are under 50%. The peak here is about 25%, which would suggest that I would need to make about a 25% change, if not a little bit more, in the value that I get from an individual in the clinic to be sure that that's a real change. And or I have to make sure that I'm measuring their activity over more than 1 day, again, particularly for walking. And finally, in this section, I just want to share with you that the sensors and the sensor data, I've been showing them mostly with stroke, but they can actually be really useful for lots of populations. Here's our typical example again, and I just want to show you some data from other populations. The top there in A is an older adult that's in a skilled nursing facility. This person was there for medical reasons, not for a particular neurologic condition. And you can see that they have a symmetrical profile, but not very much activity. They're hardly moving at all. The one in the middle is a typically developing 8-year-old. For those of you with really good eyes, you might notice that the y-axis scale here is double what it was in A. So it's expanded out, and they do a lot more high intensity bilateral activity, like running around on the playground, you know, swinging on the rings, those sorts of things. And then the one on the bottom is an 8-year-old with hemiparetic cerebral palsy. Again, the y-axis is that expanded one. So here's an example of a child who's very active, who has a fairly substantial paresis, but has figured out how to move around and be able to do the fun things that they want to be able to do every day. So that's what we really like to see. Okay, so before I move on, I'm happy to take a few more questions.
Okay, I think we still have a few questions left from previously. So one question I think was relevant was, how do measurements differ for movements that require fine motor control versus those that require gross motor skill?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that we did early on was we had people in the lab and we videotaped them as they made different movements or types of movements, and then looked at what those values looked like on the sensors. And the only thing that we weren't, so the sensor is stuck on the end of the wrist. And so it's obviously capturing movement at the shoulder and the elbow. But as you move the wrist and use the hands, you're typically moving the rest of the arm too. It's very rare that you move just the fingers and don't move anything else. And so what we found was we could detect every movement except for like a professional secretary who could type without moving her wrists at all. But like when I type and use my mouse, my wrists and my hands move. So it was able to detect activity while I'm typing. Even when I type a lot a day, it was really only the professional typers that we were unable to detect.
Okay. Next question was, do you think that individuals knowing their movement is being tracked through the sensors affects their daily activity in some way? If so, how might you control for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that comes up, that actually comes up a lot. And I think that when you first put them on, people are focused on them and might move a little bit more. When they've been wearing them for 24 or 48 or 72 hours, they tend to be annoyed that they're wearing them, but they're not doing extra activity. And in one of the projects that we did, we ran a clinical trial, and people wore the sensors before they started the trial, and then every week over an 8-week period during the trial, and then post intervention. And what we saw is actually a very, very slight decline in some of the measures. So in this trial, they were many of them improved on the capacity measures. I didn't show you this data, but nobody improved on the performance measures. And the slight decline suggests to me that people, as they started wearing these sensors, got uninterested, and wearing the sensors did not spur them to do more.
Okay. Have you compared old and new versions of the accelerometers for performance? I'd imagine that the new ones could provide feedback to the participants that could influence level of performance.
The ones we're using are what I would call research grade. So they're commercially available, but they're really intended for researchers from Actigraph. And so these don't provide feedback to the patients. There are a number of studies that are ongoing that are looking at that, but that's a tricky thing, right? Because I think that providing feedback could help, but it also may not make a difference. It depends probably on how the feedback is provided, when it's provided, and so on and so forth. There was a really interesting study in the lay press, I think it was last fall, that tracked people with activity monitors that were trying to lose weight. And the people that did not get feedback from their activity monitor actually ended up losing weight. And the people that did not lose weight. And the discussion in the lay article was, well, the people that did more activity and saw it then went out and had extra food because they were feeling good that they did the extra activity. And so assuming that giving feedback is going to result in more activity is probably not safe. We probably need to test that systematically, again, using health behavior research techniques.
Do you want one more question before we?
Sure.
So what are your thoughts about stroke survivors who have capacity, but it doesn't reflect on their performance, hand-use performance, and when they find out that they're able to, but not really using their affected hands, does this remind them to use their affected hands more in daily life?
that gets to the question of whether we can actually change these folks, right? When they, and changing it is not us changing them, it's a shared decision making to change. One of the things that you wonder about is how much capacity change is worth it to actually change my performance at home. And maybe I've already set up my environment to function pretty well, and adopted habits that allow me to do the things I need to be able to do. So I don't think it's going to be an easy thing to do. I think it's actually going to be quite challenging.
There's a few more questions. Do you want to keep going and come back to them later? Or
let me hit this last section, and then we'll take the rest of the questions.
Sounds good.
So one of the things that we're thinking about is that, we're using these sensors, we're extracting data, and they're pretty good, but they're far from perfect. And so I just want to share with you a few things thinking about the sensors themselves and the variables. And so, one of the challenges that we have is consumer grade versus research grade. And the consumer grade wearables are ubiquitous and they're easy to use. They're fairly expensive for people that are on low incomes. One of the challenges is that they're frequent, unpredicted model updates. So sometimes a new model comes out that's not backwards compatible to a previous model. Many of them give you limited access to the sensor data. Some of them have unknown proprietary algorithms that manipulate the data. And then on your screen, you get limited output variables. When we think about the research grade, a negative for that is that they require trained personnel. They're also expensive. The nice part about the ones we've been using is that the newer models are backwards compatible with the older ones, and the company has done that testing. They give us both filtered and raw access to the sensor data, but it is time consuming to process the data. We can get customized output variables. And of course, people, if we're interested in the upper limb, need to be wearing multiple sensors. And if you're interested in walking or the lower limb, oftentimes the consumer grade ones are on the wrist when you're really interested in what's happening down at the ankles. So our sensors are good, but there's plenty of room for better development. The same thing is true with our sensor variables. And so here I've represented upper limb performance in daily life in a big gray circle. And what I wanted you to take away from this picture is that each of the variables that I'm sharing with you captures one aspect of performance, but perhaps not the entire picture. And so it's probably going to be that we need multidimensional variables, not a single variable, to really understand performance in daily life. The other thing I want to show you is that variables that are going to be narrowly distributed, as I mentioned, are going to help us discriminate better than widely distributed variables. And so here I'm showing you hours of use of either the paretic limb in the stroke patients in black or the typical adults in the white. And what you can see, there's a mean value, a standard deviation value, and then the range are the arrows. And what you can see is those top bars are all very wide. And so it's going to be hard to distinguish what is normal from not normal with that variable. Whereas if you look at the bottom, we have the use ratio, and I have the, again, the mean, standard deviation, and range for typical adults and actually typical infants, which is a little bit wider, but also very well preserved in terms of the mean value. And what you can see is that's a lot more narrow. So as we get more severely impaired people with stroke down here and more mildly impaired people with stroke up here, you can start to see where they fit compared to the typical. And that's really useful to be able to identify variables that have these narrow preserved ranges in neurologically intact patient populations. And then in terms of the pie in the sky, what we'd really like for a system would be to have disposable and cheap sticker sensors that might resemble like the EKG sensors that you find stuck to you after you've had one of those in the clinic. We'd like those to have automatic upload to a secure location in the cloud, and then automatic data downloads. It would be wonderful to have seamless processing of our variables, and those variables would be the critical variables, that is, ones that have demonstrated clinical meaningfulness and responsiveness to change. And then all of this would be fed through the electronic medical record to the patient and the provider, which would then, of course, hopefully result in shared decision-making about the type of interventions that are engaged in, and the benefit of the therapy, and then perhaps better outcomes. So I do want to remind you that it's early in the process, and I like to use the telephone as the analogy. So we're starting over here with the Kellogg box wall phone around 1890. And then as we move forward, this one resembles what I had in my college dorm room in the late 80s or early 90s, although mine was tan and plastic. And then now I have this cool iPhone 10, and you can see that that phone is incredibly different from the original telephone. And so you can imagine that our journey on the sensors is going to change over time. So our future sensors and algorithms are probably going to be beyond what we can imagine in the present. The wearable sensor data that we're getting opens up new questions and potentially big new problems about whether or not people are really benefiting from some of the services that we're providing. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, just because we can measure this behavior doesn't mean that we're going to change it. Moving on, if someone gets fired up about using wearable sensors in these patient populations, I would love to have you take a look at our PhD or postdoc in movement science at Washington University. Beyond myself, there's a number of talented investigators that are doing studies kind of at the biological intersection of mechanics, energetics, and control systems. And I just like to end by saying that measurement of movement with wearable sensors will lead to better rehabilitation outcomes in the future. It can be more efficient and more effective rehab. So I'm going to stop right there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lang. Fantastic talk. We do have a few more questions that are pending here. So I'll go through. I was wondering whether over-reporters would remain over-reporters when individuals were self-reporting at 2 different time points.
That's a great question. And some over-reporters remained over-reporters, and some over-reporters did not remain over-reporters. And actually, the really funny thing that we saw that we hadn't really thought about was as people came in and entered the trial, and they filled out these questionnaires, and the questionnaire basically asks them to grade what percentage of the time on a numeric scale that they're incorporating their paretic limb into everyday life, and or whether they have difficulties doing particular activities. And you know, when they come in, they often over-report, right? They say, "Oh yes, I have no trouble doing that," or "Oh, I use my arm all the time." And then as they engage in therapy, when they're partway through, they actually adjust their scores on the questionnaire, and they become a little bit more realistic about whether they were using their limb or not. So there's some changes that occur during the therapy as well, particularly with the over-reporters. One of the challenges that we have, though, is we don't know who's an over-reporter, and we don't know whether, if you are an over-reporter, if you're going to stay an over-reporter. And so it just suggests that we're going to need much larger sample sizes for self-report based measures in order to see them than you might with the more direct measures.
Next question was, how does flaccidity or spasticity factor into your measures?
So flaccidity or spasticity would be measures that we would capture impairment, right? So they would be the same thing as, not the same thing, but conceptually they would be in the category of measuring somatosensation and measuring strength as well. And so all of the people with stroke that we engage would have some degree of spasticity that could be measured. Some of the people in the longitudinal cohort I showed you were flaccid to begin with and stayed flaccid. Some people were flaccid and then became spastic by 6 months post-stroke. So it's just a different level of measurement. They don't actually factor into the measure. It's just a different construct.
Thank you. For the capacity performance measure for the lower limbs, is there any way to control for at-home lifestyle differences between patients? For example, differentiate between patients who may lead more sedentary lifestyles and take less steps per day versus those who are more active?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of the challenges, I think, the easy part about the upper limb stuff is you get this narrow variable. The hard part about the lower limb stuff is you've got these steps per day, which is a broad range. And so it's hard for me to know, unless I ask the person or the person happens to have measurements before their stroke, how active they were. There's also some merit in thinking about, stroke is a cardiovascular disease. And so whether that person was sedentary before or not may not be the important thing. In terms of helping them set their goals, I may need them to be more active because that will help prevent a second stroke. So the answer to your question is it's complicated, but certainly talking with the patient and figuring out their levels of activity and then trying to get them either back where they were if they were active or above where they were if they were inactive to help prevent further comorbid conditions from making their lives more difficult.
Thank you. Next question I think is important. Are there any sex differences in clinic versus real life performance discrepancies?
We have not seen any sex differences, though we've looked, and we have actually not seen any age differences when you look at 40 to 80-year-olds. We do have a sample that started at age 0 to 17. And the most active ages are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then as they hit the double digits in the teenage years, on average, the levels of activity start to decrease a little bit, which makes a lot of sense in terms of video games, phone time, sitting in school all day with no recess, things like that. And then, those 16, 17, 18-year-olds look just like the 40 through 80. And in all of those categories, you have really active people and really inactive people.
Thank you. Next one. Since limb use seems to be impaired bilaterally, is a decreased capacity of the contralateral limb physiologically impaired or psychologically?
Oh, well, this then gets in the definition of psychologically, right? There is some data to suggest from Bob Sainberg's group out of Penn State University that the intact limb or the limb that is ipsilateral to the side of the stroke is not completely normal, and that this problem is worse in the more severe strokes. The magnitude of the problem is, of course, substantially smaller than the magnitude of the problem on the paretic side. So I think that that there's probably some physiologic factor, but there might also be a psychological one.
Thank you. Are there timeframes during the course of rehabilitation when using capacity measures may be more appropriate or clinically more relevant than performance measures and vice versa?
That is a great question, and that's one that we talk about all the time. I actually think that when I first started, I was hoping that you could have these sensor measures at home and you would never need measures in the clinic. This is, again, pie in the sky, far into the future. I don't think that's going to be the case, because I think that this intersection between what people can do and what they do becomes really important for the actual selection of rehabilitation interventions and how you might tailor those interventions to a particular individual. So I anticipate that we're going to need both. But I would say that one of the things I'm less interested in is some of my colleagues at other institutions are busy trying to be able to predict performance from capacity and a bunch of other measures, like trying to find a formula. And I don't think that that's not worth time, but it's something that we've chosen not to do because we'd rather directly measure performance, because it's actually easier and more accurate to directly measure it than it is to spend 5 or 10 years coming up with the perfect model that will predict it.
Okay, couple more questions. Maybe some more accurate classification are needed based on brain lesion area rather than using descriptive statistics like machine learning methods, for example, K nearest neighbors.
Well, I can't speak to the machine learning methods. Those are statistical essentially statistical models based on probabilities that require very, very large sample sizes to be good. And we don't have those sample sizes. I will say that, you know, brain lesion area and stroke size interact, right? So you can have, at least in terms of motor deficit, so you can have a large stroke that only nips part of the primary motor cortex, and have relatively mild deficits, or you can have a very small stroke that happens to be right in that posterior limb of the internal capsule, and you can have a dense hemiparesis on one side of the body. So the brain lesion characteristics have traditionally not been that good at even predicting impairment in capacity. So I suspect that the level of performance is going to be even harder to predict because we're moving further and further away from the basic biology.
All right, last question. If an individual can set up their environment so that they can go on with their daily life without additional performance, has the primary goal of rehabilitation been reached?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess I'm going to say yes, but this again is that shared decision making. It's not me as the clinician deciding what your therapy goals are. It's us deciding together what you're hoping to accomplish. And if you've accomplished everything, then there's no need for you to, that you want to do, not necessarily what I want you to do, but what you want to do. Then there's no need for you to come back and in the case of in the US, continue to pay for services that if you're happy with where you're at or satisfied with where you're at.
Sorry, I lied. I said that was the last question, but one more came in. When monitoring people post-stroke at home, were participants at home performing specific activities suggested by the therapists, or were they performing their normal daily routine?
So different cohorts that we've studied have had different suggestions. What I will tell you is the cohort that participated in our trial, it was a dose response trial. And so they got different doses in the clinic. And then because we were wanting to monitor the dose, we didn't want them to repeat the same activities at home, but we asked them to try and incorporate what they were learning and doing in therapy into their activities. So for example, if somebody was practicing a writing task in the clinic, then we suggested to them and had a discussion with them every week or so about, are you doing any more writing at home? Are you using that hand to write the grocery list? Maybe you could write a letter to your cousin, those sorts of things. And so we were asking people to engage more in that, again, in that trial, out of the 70 plus people that were enrolled, not a single one changed on any performance measure that we were able to derive over time, even though they were changing on the capacity measures. There's nothing like being wrong about your dose trial and then finding out that what you were doing and thought you were helping people didn't actually get them better in their daily life.
All right, we've gone through all the questions. Thank you so much again. Really a wonderful talk. And so I wish we could all applaud you in person, but it'll have to be virtual. But thanks again. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. One more. How does time of plateau in the measures relate to what time frames are being used for treatment?
Oh, that's a good question, right? So the use ratio was plateauing at about 3 weeks. And, for us, that would be, if they got to go to inpatient rehab, that would be when they were still there, just about when they're being discharged home. If they were at a skilled nursing facility, they would still be at home. I'm sorry, they would still be in the skilled nursing facility. The 4 to 6 weeks, certainly in our sample, the majority of people still had rehab services out to about 12 weeks post-stroke. So it wasn't like they weren't trying to change in their impairment and capacity, but what I don't know is how much of their therapy services were focused on trying to change performance versus the other two.
All right, thanks again. So great to see so many questions, and thanks for your answers to all of them. That's fantastic. So thanks everybody for joining, and again, a virtual round of applause. It was a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.